everybody, it's Drybear. We just finished a month-long process of building leveling builds for Path of Exile 2, so I wanted to review all of them with you today. So when Early Access first came out, I asked my audience what they valued more, very polished, hyper-efficient endgame builds, or if they wanted more leveling builds. And so what I was seeing a lot in my chat at the time was there were a lot of people that were wanting to get on the train of Path of Exile 2. It was, blowing up, it's still being played a lot, but there were a lot of people that were being attracted to the game that hadn't played ARPGs before or hadn't played Path of Exile before. They were just plain daunted by the amount of choice that you have, as well as the sheer size of the skill tree, saying that they want to play, but they're kind of intimidated and may not even start in the first place. Even had people that had gone their own way, learned a whole lot, read every tooltip for a class, got through the campaign and decided that the class wasn't for them, but the thought of having to go and relearn all of the mechanics for a brand new class and read all of the tooltips just was too much of an effort and seemed like it was just going to be too much, so they decided not to continue on. So what I wanted to do was create a bunch of leveling builds that are as optimized as I could make them at the time. They're not perfect by any means, but it is a sound basis for putting together abilities. The groundwork is done for the theory crafting, and all of the skill trees are done up to a point where you can clear the campaign. And it explores all classes, all ascendancies, everything in the game. So if you wanted to have a specific ascendancy or specific class, I tried to explore as many mechanics that I could find that were viable for clearing the campaign. And that way you can get into the game, learn the mechanics, learn the trade, learn, experience the story. And then when you get through the story and it's time to start pushing endgame, that's when you can start modifying the build, changing it, or even swapping into an endgame build version. Now, I put some restrictions on these builds specifically so they could be used for the purpose that we are talking about here. And that is, there are no uniques in any of these builds. I know there are ways to make these builds better using uniques. That has been commented a lot along this journey as we've been making these builds and putting them together, but I wanted to make sure that they were usable by a brand new player starting their first character inside of early access or beyond. They didn't have access to any uniques. There's no uniques in any of these builds, and all of these builds work with only 2-socket gems. You don't have to have any Jeweler's Orbs or anything expanded on that. Again, as you push through Cruel, you'll get 1 or 2 Jeweler's Orbs, and as you go to endgame, you'll get more and more, but I didn't want to give people a brand new leveling build that required a 3 or 4 socket for it to run properly. So if it couldn't work without uniques and with only 2 sockets on all the gems, then it wasn't good enough for me to ship as a leveling build. Now I'll put down below in the comments and the description the build link and the video for all of the builds listed here. Again, it's going over all 6 classes and all 12 ascendancies if you're interested in that. And again, they are not completely optimized. They're probably 70th to 80th percentile, maybe a little bit higher in some cases, and they are sound enough in the theory crafting for the mechanics of the build, but there's definitely optimizations you could make as you push towards endgame, and maybe even if you find things that function better for you. But the goal was to find a solid starting point for people to launch off of, and also give people some ideas and inspiration for what they want to make for their build, or maybe just give them a point where they can get into the game and get their feet wet while they're exploring the rest of the mechanics, the crafting, the trading, the campaign, surviving, things like that. And if you ever get confused or want an explanation, I have a video covering each one of these builds, going over how to play it, what the rotation is, what you're looking for, how the skills work, how the stats combine together, and a summary of my thoughts after the theory crafting we did on that build specifically at the time. Starting with the warrior, there are a bunch of things in the warrior's kit that if you fall for building it early on, especially until we get some more buffs, it's going to feel very weird in the game. So this one is a warrior totem build focused primarily on the warrior totems, and what's great about this is if you go Warbringer, you get a whole bunch of really cool summons that come along with the totems as well. So when you put totems down, it will randomly cycle between different minions. There's a turtle that spawns that has an aura. When you stay on the aura, you have more defense. There's a buff you get from the Hornblower. The caster gives you all kinds of really cool buffs and damage that comes out. So you can group up enemies and blow them up. And the damage that comes out from the totems is quite respectable, and you have some really good combinations there as too. What's great about this on top of everything else is not only does it give you more survivability with the totems themselves, but it also gives you some really good setups for some of the combo-based abilities in the warrior's kit, because you have things like Bone Shatter or Perfect Strike that allow you to do a very exceptional thing if you meet the right conditions or you set up the right animation. And by playing off of the totems in front of you, it gives you a very easy way to do this on the totem build. So this one is actually one of my favorites. I just love seeing all the little ancestral friends walking around, and it gives you some variety while you're playing around as well. And there are plenty of totem builds that you can run in endgame that are just as good and can scale insanely well for endgame play. Next is a shield build. There are actually a lot of abilities in the warrior kit that are based on your currently equipped shield. And the more armor the shield has, the more damage these shield abilities do. Things like the shield wall or the shield charge. And these actually give you some really awesome options for not only using defense from the shield and building for armor and defense while dealing damage as well, but also the fact that it means that you can use the active block feature, which is a really cool part of the Path of Exile 2 system. So you have the block as a passive stat, which a lot of ARPGs do have. If you have a shield equipped or you have any chance to block, you can reduce damage or have a block effect trigger automatically on anything that happens around you. But you also have an active block, which is a little bit more like a action RPG, like Souls-like third-person camera, where you can bring up the shield and do some extra damage, or you can block and absorb damage that way, and instead it goes to your stun meter, like Sekiro, being able to build up your stagger meter that way instead of taking damage with a partial parry. There's also some cool mechanics where you can do like parries, essentially, where if you bring up the block in the first few frames of the block, if you take damage, it'll trigger a backlash attack on it as well. So if you like the shield warrior, it's going to be a little bit slower than some of the other builds, but it's quite effective and very capable of clearing the entire campaign. Next up is the fire warrior. There's a bunch of really strong nodes right next to the start of the warrior skill tree that allow you to play off of fire in general. You actually, like right at the very beginning of the skill tree, you get a bunch of damage, chance to ignite and burn. You have things like Infernal Cry, which can apply to enemies and make them explode in fire damage. And they also have the easiest access out of all characters. So the the warrior plus the marauder starting section can get to the Avatar Flame keystone the easiest. And Avatar Flame just allows you to convert all damage to fire, and you only deal fire damage. So you can put down flame walls through the Molten Blast through the wall, do some really cool damage that way. And it's super fun to play this way because it feels like you're playing almost like an armor / caster with a different variety to it. And then you kind of just play through the game as a warrior slinging fire all over the place, and gives you some nice synergy with other things as well without needing to build too much of a multi-stat while you're leveling. Next up is the Slam Warrior, and this is the last of the 4 warrior leveling builds. And this one is really tough because if you don't know what makes slams effective and you're not as good at kind of planning things out, it can really feel bad if you're not using the right stats or building the build correctly. However, using Rolling Slam until you get Leap Slam, then using Leap Slam, and then you have Sunder, you can actually do some ridiculous damage. And there are some cases where you can just spam Sunder over and over, and then if you can't because of the animation time, you can use Rolling Slam as well as Leap Slam. And again, I go through the full list of stats and everything in the build guide itself on how to actually build it and put it together. The highest damage does come from Giant's Blood with 2 two-handers, which is super cool, and you feel like you're playing that warrior class fantasy of just being a big hulking brute running around slamming. And they even added, even after I made this build, another gem that can be used to modify aftershocks on slams as well. But the best part about this build is that you have good AoE, but you have crazy single target. There are times where the aftershock will just go off all at once, and you can just hit a target and then just get, like, there's some bosses that just get absolutely deleted from this while you're leveling because you do so much damage. Moving on to the Mercenary, another one that people struggle with stat-wise, and it's actually a super fun, unique class to play, and I recommend that everyone tries a Mercenary at least once because they feel so just unique among the classes that we have now. So the first build is going to be one around grenades. This one was super popular when the game first came out and is still very popular now and very strong now, though some people have tried more hybrid builds in general. But what I like about grenades is not only can you do crazy AoE, but you have lots of burst as well. And there's so many ways to add additional grenades to when you fire. There's a crossbow that gives you additional grenades. There are some passive skill tree points that give you additional grenades. So you just have these explosions going off. It is very different because you do have a fuse time on the grenades, which means you're playing a little bit more tactically. You're thinking about where you're putting the grenades, when they're going to pop off, and what you're doing. And you're kind of playing around that safe space as you move around, which again is very unique relative to what you might experience with other classes. But I think the grenades build is very aesthetic for the Mercenary and super fun to level with. Next up is a very simple build, and that is around the high velocity rounds that you get from Mercenary. So these are the single shot at base high damage single target burst, and we function around using our gas grenades to shred the target's armor, and then we add armor explosion to the gas grenade so it does our AoE for us. So with enough damage on the gas grenade and the armor explosion, we have our AoE, and then we can burst single target with the high velocity rounds. This one's very simple, very straightforward. If you just want to walk around and shoot and get a lot of value out of it, I think that the high velocity rounds is a very easy way to get through the campaign on Mercenary, and it also opens up some interesting opportunities for late game depending on how you want to use your crossbow overall. Galvanic Shards is this shotgun kind of ability that just shoots in a cone in front of you and does lightning damage, but we combo it with things like Lightning Rod. This one wasn't super popular the first few days of Mercenary, but actually just rocketed in popularity as people were looking for ways to deal damage in the end game. And unfortunately, most of the best builds in the game right now, Archmage Spark, or even using Invoker with Tempest Flurry or Stormwave, are all basically lightning builds. It's just kind of wild how good lightning is right now. Even Deadeye with Lightning Arrow, Lightning Rod, and some variants there. So I think the Galvanic Shards is a very straightforward way to build. You'll clear through trash like it's nothing. Like mobbing on this build is incredibly straightforward and easy. Everything just blows away. If you don't build properly, you can sometimes slow down a little bit on single target, but I think it's super fun because it gives you a great path into endgame. There's a lot of ways you could build it. You can also swap between bow and with the crossbow if you wanted to, depending on how you want to play it, but it's a very aesthetic way to play a martial class that's also doing elemental damage. Moving on to Witch, we have a couple different ways you can go here. This one I just, I didn't really want to make only a fire minion build, so I messed around with a whole bunch of different minion types, and there are some really cool things you could do with the Storm Mages late game and the Reapers as well, and have some cool options there. But I wanted a leveling build that was very sustainable and easy to play, and that is the Cold Minion. So we get the Frost Mages as our rotation here, and we built entirely a Witch out of Cold from that. This one is super safe because you have lots of CC with Chill and Freeze as part of it, and dealing, with rares, the rares, elites, and of course the normal mobs is super easy. But this one does have a little bit of a struggle on single target depending on how you build it. So you all want to make sure that you either have some way to deal single target, or you're also just keeping up with your gear as you go along. But I think it's super fun because it has so much Frost and Freeze buildup, and the way your minions work is they have tons of damage themselves, but they have the activatable command abilities to drop Frost Bombs. The bombs themselves do tons of damage, and then when you get to a boss, you can just chip away at them, get them frozen, shatter them, get tons of really easy damage on top of them, and you can kind of sit behind your minions if you need to. And I also go over the theory crafting around minions in general if you wanted to modify this to include a whole army or put some other minions inside of this one. Next is the Infernalist Fire Minion using the Arsonist. The builds wouldn't be complete without this, just because it is one of the best builds in the game right now. Early game, mid game, late game, incredibly powerful. The Arsonist scale insanely well, and we'll use the Summon Raging Spirits to be able to deal damage this way as well. It is so bursty, so powerful, and you have a lot of front line to protect you. It's not as safe as the Cold Minions because there's not any CC, but at least there's body blocking and cannon fodder in front of you that you use to body block projectiles or attacks or things like that. And it does a crazy amount of damage. So if you want to play into that Infernal Hound, Fire Witch with fire minions, this Hell's Army coming out from you, this is the build to go for, and this is one of the better builds in the late game as well. So if you wanted to just have a transition into end game, this one would be super smooth. Next up, there were people that just don't like minions on Witch. They like the idea of the concept of Witch, but they don't want to run a minion build. So we made two builds that don't have any minions at all, that are perfectly capable of clearing the entire campaign and moving into end game as well. So the first one is going to be a Bone build. This one is built primarily off of Bone Storm, which is that big volley you see over your head that flies forward. What's cool about the volley is it actually not only does it do a whole bunch of physical spell damage, you can actually just burst targets down that way, and you all have a ton of things in the Witch and Blood Mage skill tree that allows you to, get health back, but also be able to cause bleeds and critical strikes on this, and our crit on this is insanely high. Most hits are crits with this, and you do some crazy high damage, but also Bone Storm applies a debuff to the target that is a stackable debuff. You'll see it on the enemies there. When you hit a target that has that debuff with a physical martial attack, it will deal additional physical damage. So with this, we actually run with all bone casting spells and then a crossbow in our offhand that allows us to use a high rapid fire like a machine gun, because each stack can only take one hit at a time. So you throw a bone storm, you get 20 stacks on the target, you pull out your machine gun, you blast them down, burn all the stacks away, and you can swap back and forth. And we use things that break armor, which can give us more damage on the physical side. And it's basically a pure physical witch caster that just burns through all targets. It's very good at single target and quite good at AoE to a certain size as well, and just super unique and fun. But that's not the only one. We wanted to make another Blood Mage build that was minionless as well, and this is one focused entirely on chaos. And what's interesting is there's actually a lot of difference between chaos damage that's applied through spells and curses and the chaos damage that's applied through martial skills and weapon attacks. Those are, theory crafting wise, quite different. They have different scalars, they get applied differently, they have all kinds of different things. So it was fun to do like Monk, Hand of Chayula, Poison Ranger, and a Chaos Witch, because they all function differently. So if you're curious about how the spell casting version of this works, you'll be able to go to this build. There are some things that I would improve if I were to go back and do it again, but I think this one is more of the Warlock, like Affliction Warlock playstyle, where you can actually just put a whole bunch of curses and dots all over the place. They spread everywhere, and you do tons of chaos damage, which is super fun, and it synergizes perfectly with the Blood Mage Ascendancy, which allows us to do a bunch of really fun stuff, just blowing up targets. I think it's just one of the more satisfying ones to look at. Moving on to Ranger, there's a lot of synergy with poison, with physical damage, and also with lightning, and you'll find that most Ranger builds right now are focused on the lightning side, but there's a ton of synergy with Pathfinder and poison, and a bunch of different ways you can go as well. You can go with pure upfront crit poison. Again, I know dots don't crit, but the way poison works for martial classes is more like a bleed. The size of the damage that applied the poison scales the dot of the poison, which means you can run a martial physical damage poison build on Ranger that allows you to scale the dot damage as well, which is super fun. So this is what this is. It's gonna be focusing a lot on the poison dot and the explosion damage of pustules and things like that. So if you like the Poison Ranger, this one's super fun to scale with. And there's plenty of things in the kit as well, and I wanted to make one that wasn't just lightning arrow, lightning rod, that is just kind of like rampant in the leveling scene, because that's one of the best builds for leveling in the game. But I don't want to leave anyone out. If you wanted to do Lightning Ranger leveling, we have one of those as well. This functions basically off of Lightning Arrow and Lightning Rod. Currently, in the state of the game right now, it is one of the best leveling combinations, and you'll see this show up in different classes and hybrid options as well, just because it's so crazy good. And the way this works is you put lightning rods, basically stakes in the ground, that if lightning damage occurs near them, they flare up and shoot lightning all over the place. So you put the lightning rods on the ground and you shoot lightning arrow out, and everything on the ground gets electrocuted, all the enemies get electrocuted, and you do great single target damage, you do great AoE damage. It's very efficient, and probably is the most efficient leveling build for Ranger overall, if that's something that you're looking for. And the last build is a physical Ranger build, and again, because poison functions like bleed, we kind of have a similar idea here in that we're trying to maximize the initial hit that applies the bleed. I actually tried every class that can do a bleed, I try to do a bleed build, and every single time except for this specific build, I ended up throwing it away. I tried to do an Earthquake bleed build for Warrior, tried to do a bleed build for Monk. Both of them were just too, like, they didn't meet the bar required, at least in my mind, of this is good enough to ship, and so I just threw it out. However, the Ranger one did work out, because we can kneel down and snipe. Not only does this do great AoE damage, we can scale off of physical damage, but we can also do this big snipe burst, which is awesome for single target, because you can make snipe hit incredibly hard, but then because bleed is based on the hit that applied the bleed, then the bleed that comes from the snipe is insanely hard as well, and everything just does a whole bunch of damage from that standpoint. So this one is super unique. You're running Shockwave Totem, Barrage to modify your snipe, Frost Arrow or Frost Salvo, which gives you scaling damage off physical. It converts most physical damage into cold damage, which gives you a nice way to slow enemies down and do your snipe. This one's super weird, kind of out there, but works incredibly well for leveling, and it's just kind of like a fun take on the Ranger that isn't just using Lightning Rod, Lightning Arrow. Moving on to Sorceress, this is, like Ranger, one of the better leveling class, probably the most well-built class in the game right now, just as far as available options and variety and things that you can do. However, I wanted to make a very unique build. There aren't a lot of Fire Sorceress builds out there, and there aren't a lot of Chronomancer builds out there. So this is a Fire, Incinerate, Chronomancer, Ignite build for Sorceress that is incredibly powerful and very good. You basically turn into a fire sprinkler, It's super fun, and I think it'll get you through normal and cruel all through the campaign, and then you have to figure out what you want to do for endgame with this one. But this one focuses on the fact that when you use Incinerate as a channeling spell, it ramps up your Ignite. The Ignite damage itself is quite good, but you run into problems with being able to stay alive and being able to manage your resources. We solve that with the Temporal Rift from Chronomancer, where we can stand still, set all the Ignites that we want on all the enemies, and then we can roll back time to get our mana back and our HP back. We also run Mind Over Matter, which is a keystone in the kind of Templar Druid / Sorceress Witch side of the skill tree that allows you to take damage through mana before it takes damage through health, which means that you'll actually use mana and health together as a combined defensive resource. But because when you use Temporal Rift on Chronomancer, you roll back your energy shield, your health, and your mana to an earlier point in time, which means that you can spam all you want, take a bunch of damage, roll back, spam all you want, and just keep doing it, and it gives you the freedom to stand still and be the fire sprinkler you always wanted to be. No Sorceress would be complete without the pure Ice Freeze Shatter build as well. This one is probably one of my most favorite, just because visually it's so fun to look at. You see all the enemies freezing and then shattering, and it's just ice chunks flying all over the screen all the time. The damage is very good. It's not quite as strong as, say, like a lightning build in the current state, but with some balance changes, it could very easily become one of the better ones. And this one uses the elemental storm that we have from Stormweaver, which means that when you do elemental damage, you have a chance to create a storm. That thing's spinning on the ground right there, and that actually does a very large, respectable amount of damage. You can also cause your frost bolts to detonate. You freeze everything in your way. You're basically this walking storm front. This is exactly what they were worried about in Game of Thrones when the winter is coming, except this time you are the winter, not what you need to be afraid of. It's super fun, very flexible, a lot of build up, and again, just like any glacial or ice cold freeze build, it's very safe as well because you have such a high amount of crowd control, which means you can just walk through maps and clear through the campaign very easily. Next up is a critical arc build. You could run this with Spark if you wanted to, but there is a ridiculous amount of synergy with critical strikes and critical damage bonus for lightning for the Sorceress on their side of the skill tree. And so this focuses primarily on the chain lightning ability arc, which is super fun and very satisfying. So it is by default a rather slow ability. It has a pretty long windup. So with this, we're basically going to build entirely around arc, which means we run a lot of cast speed, a lot of skill speed, and then a lot of critical strike chance. But basically you walk around as Zeus himself. You light up, you shoot one arc, it's going to chain across the entire screen and do so much damage that usually single mobs get one shot by it, and then you'll usually only have to cast it a couple times for rares and elites as you're going through. As soon as it crits, it's going to just blow everything on your screen up, and does great single target for bosses as well. Now, if you wanted to, I didn't end up doing a Spark build for leveling because I felt like it was a little overdone. Spark, leveling for Sorceress is probably the fastest leveling build in the game right now, alongside Lightning Arrow, Lightning Rod for Ranger. So you could probably modify this build to just be Spark if you wanted to, but I wanted to do something at least a little bit different, as the whole point of this process is to show off what is available in the game and get people thinking. Next up is Tri-Element. If you look in the skill tree for the Sorceress, there's actually a bunch of clusters of nodes that are around dealing multiple element types and also multiple ailments as well. There's a bunch of things like if you ignited recently, get a bunch of damage. If you've chilled recently, get a bunch of damage. If you've shocked recently, get a bunch of damage. And so this build uses the entire elemental kit of Sorceress. We basically will be igniting, chilling, and shocking constantly, giving us those big options for damage. We'll be running Spark through the fire flame wall that allows us to get a bunch of fire damage, shock damage, lightning damage. It has great single target and great AoE, and it's very ailment based as well. A lot of times they'll end up dying to the ignite, or the damage amp takes them out, or you'll freeze them and they'll end up shattering. And all these elements and different things going together with the build makes it super visually fun to look at. There's just all these different colors and elements going around. You're like the actual avatar with this, and I think it's just kind of a nice take on what Spark is normally, rather than just doing Spark by itself. It takes advantage of the ailment scaling and the multi-element scaling that Sorceress already has. Finally, we have the Monk, and the first one to talk about is the Hand of Chayula, which I call Chalupa just because it's more fun to say. This one was a huge challenge because I think the state of Chalupa right now is not quite as good as it probably could be. I think that Chaos damage from like Poison on Ranger is very good. Chaos damage on Witch is very good. But as we talked about earlier in the video, chaos damage for martial classes gets treated differently than it does for spell casting and curses, which makes this kind of situation very odd. There's also a lot of weirdnesses, and I talk about this in my monk review in the current state right now for Chalupa, in that there are things that want you to, you can either go pure chaos damage for the monk, or you can go pure physical damage and convert the physical damage into chaos damage. It's hard to go both. You kind of gimp yourself if you end up going both. And I'm sure a lot of people that are running Chalupa end up in that same situation, that some of the abilities, like the Mantra of Destruction, converts damage done or converts physical damage into chaos damage. But you're in a really weird spot of like, if you try to get as much physical damage as you can and then get bonus chaos damage, it feels like you're just weaker than if you went Invoker in the first place. And if you try to build all chaos damage, it's not going to scale as well because your base physical isn't high enough to give you a good base point for the chaos damage. So it's kind of awkward. The solution that I came up with, which was arguably not the most thematic for this, is we just build it with a wand and do chaos damage, and then we use Hand of Chayula, which is the chaos damage punch for monk that allows you to apply curses and things like that, and by itself actually does a good amount of chaos damage. So this is a pure chaos damage build for monk that uses Chalupa, Profane Ritual, Hand of Chayula. It uses wands, it uses chaos damage, but it's not the true Chalupa that I think a lot of people would want for. It's just way more effective to build this way for leveling. You could, which I didn't have time to, do a pure physical Hand of Chayula, like Chayula, Acolyte of Chayula build, where you build mostly physical with some chaos nodes on top. And you would be a little bit slower than this build, and you would probably be a lot slower than an Invoker build, but maybe there are buffs coming soon that might make this work. I just wanted to put out at least one Chalupa build that people could use for leveling that's incredibly effective. Moving on to Cold for Monk, there's actually a bunch of options. Ice Strike is very good. There's a whole bunch of really cool things you can add to the Monk build, and just like the Cold Minion build for Witch, or the Cold Caster build for Sorceress, you have a lot of CC built into the kit, which means that you can actually control a lot of fights. And also this one transitions very well into endgame, because again, one of the better builds in the game right now is an Invoker based off Cold, and there's a unique that allows you to shatter in a ripple effect, which means shatter causes a shatter, and you can clear entire screens with your frost effects on an Invoker monk, which is super cool. This one is very effective, very safe as well. Probably one of the most laid back experiences you can get in the game right now for leveling is just running a Cold Invoker and just freeze everything, blow it all up, do a bunch of damage. And just like most martial elemental classes, you can convert most of your physical damage into cold and then scale elemental once that's done, which gives you a very easy double dip in damage output and scales really well into endgame as well. This one's just an easy slam dunk. Stormwave shares a little bit of a functionality as the critical arc build that we made for the Sorceress, in that it does a ton of damage and scales very well with critical strike. And again, just like Sorceress, Monk has a lot of available critical strike in the early part of their skill tree. So we can get this online very quickly. You can get upwards of 35 to 50% crit chance with like 300 plus critical strike damage while leveling as a lightning invoker, which is crazy strong. And this one's safe because you can sit back at max range. I like running long shot as a support gem for this one, which means that the farther away you are, the more damage you do. So you can just sit back and just make sure you're hitting damage from the Stormwave, and it's super chill. And again, this one also has a very nice late game variant where you just run Stormwave as an AoE with 3 projectiles and it burns everything down in front of you. You're basically just walking around swinging like you're cleaning up like a janitor, anything in front of you. The damage in single target is super high, the damage in AoE is super high, and it's just very, again, very chill, just like the Cold Monk leveling build. Our last build of the 22 leveling builds is a melee focused lightning monk, the Tempest Flurry. What's great about this ability is, again, just like Stormwave, it scales very well for the monk early on, but what's cool about it too is that it is a hit chain ability, which means you go through a sequence of hits, and when you get to the end of the sequence, you get a bunch of effects that come off of it. There's also a lot of different support gems that allow you to do the last hit multiple times, and for Tempest Flurry specifically, when you get to the last hit, it causes like a lightning strikes to land all around you. So you build attack speed, skill speed, martial tempo, and you just start spinning, 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 spinning. Anything in melee range with you dies because you're doing melee attacks, but also you're constantly triggering these lightning strikes all over you that builds properly with like Herald of Thunder very very easily, and you're just kind of burning through everything. The single target is insane, the AoE is insane, and it also works very well with Tempest Bell, which is one of the more iconic abilities for the monk. You put the Tempest Bell down, anytime you strike it with a quarterstaff attack, it'll ripple. It can gain elements like lightning, and so in AoE, you just clear everything with your Tempest, with your Tempest Flurry, and when you get to single target on a boss, you put a bell down, and you just make sure that when you're doing the Tempest Flurry, you're hitting the bell and the boss at the same time, so you double up on your damage. You're dealing damage with Tempest Flurry, you're dealing damage with the lightning strike, and you're dealing damage on the bell, which is regurgitating, like echoing out, reverberating your damage that you're dealing to the bell directly. Super fast, super easy. This one is probably my favorite leveling build for monk in general, but that is just kind of like a very easy pickup for the monk too. So there you go, 22 leveling builds for the Path of Exile 2 Early Access. Again, these builds aren't perfect. They don't have everything min-maxed to the very nth degree. There's undoubtedly mistakes in there that you will be able to adjust and fix, but the goal of this was to very quickly get a suite, an actual catalog of builds that work well for leveling, that can get people into the game, and you can preview them here, see which ones you like, see which ones are cool, try them out, and then make modifications as you go through the story and start moving into endgame. And hopefully this alleviates the the ranked anxiety of trying to get into a build and use it, because oftentimes people just feel like they're too overwhelmed to learn everything in the game, and it's nice to have a foundation that's done for you so you can start into the game and work your way into endgame. And of course the next step is then to start working on actual endgame builds that are more polished and more put together, that have more things built into them. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.